Hello and welcome to another video. I haven't done one for a while, so I just want to give an overview of a topic that I find very interesting. You may have noticed that the Taiwanese Navy is looking increasingly like the Ukrainian Navy. Why is that? Will it work? What are the systems they're developing? So I am H.I. Sutton. I'm an independent defense analyst. I focus on unconventional naval warfare capability strategy. Principally, I'm using open source intelligence, certainly for this presentation. It's unscripted, unedited, all the usual caveats. Let's get on with it. Firstly, why does Taiwan need a navy? The Chinese Navy, and this is their ensign, is formidable. It's growing, it's the largest navy, and it's arguably catching up and in some areas surpassing even the US Navy. In particular, they have amphibious forces that could land on Taiwan. Now, historically, this was something of a joke. There was a popular saying, the million man swim, things like that. The mental image of Chinese landing craft attacking Taiwan. This is unscripted. I'll just carry on. Um, Looks something like this: out of date, vulnerable, actually quite limited in numbers. But Chinese amphibious forces have modernized dramatically, now have assault carriers comparable to the ones in service with the US Navy. This allows them to do much more aircraft type heliborne assaults, things like that, but also to assault from different angles and at different standoff ranges and with much greater quantity. But these amphibious forces would only be a spearhead of an invasion. The real bulk of the troops would come up in civilian ships, ferries, typically roll on, roll off ferries. And very recently, I was able to reveal this in naval news. China's been building a couple of sets of special mobile piers, as it were, these invasion barges, for want of a better term. These are really impressive, interesting, quite innovative. I've done a video on separately, but the point is that the sense that an invasion is coming is growing, not just from a political perspective, but from the ability of China to actually do that, to actually land troops. And of course, it's not just amphibious forces. China has a massive conventional navy, right up to super carriers, such as this one. It's got submarines, everything like that. And an invasion of Taiwan, I'm focused very much on the naval aspects because we're going to talk about uncrewed service vessels, things like this. But you've got to remember that it's not only a naval game. Taiwan is incredibly close to China, and China has a huge number of rockets and missiles that it could launch at Taiwan, almost certainly could or would. And there's aircraft and things like this. So Taiwan really is staring down the barrel. What are they doing about it? Well, the traditional approach is to have a very high quality navy. They've got a sizable navy. I'm not going to say it's small, but compared to mainland China, the People's Republic of China, um, it is much smaller, but high quality. I think in general they're losing the quality edge to the mainland Chinese. There's no real doubt actually they've lost it. 20, 30 years ago, you could argue it differently. Now there's no doubt that China is able to build as sophisticated or more sophisticated and certainly more capable and larger and more numerous warships. So Taiwan's hope of defending itself with conventional naval forces pretty slim. They do, of course, have a lot of anti-ship missiles, and they have some very good ones, homegrown ones, such as this supersonic one. These missiles, interesting topic of their own right. How long they're going to last in a war is difficult to say, but potentially very formidable. The main problem, though, is again, there's not very many of them, not in comparison to the number of targets and how many you'd expect to expend on a given target. There's sort of thing that is very formidable against a warship and in many scenarios, but it's not really going to decimate an invasion fleet that we're talking about. Additionally, Taiwan has got a small submarine service. They've just built their first indigenous submarine. Here it is. Pretty modern boat, very respectable, really interesting. Nowhere near enough of them. And more unconventional capabilities. Taiwan is one of the few countries with a mine laying capability in a sort of a a conscious, conspicuous strategy and capability. This is a mine-laying boat, really interesting, quite a new build thing. No doubt it's going to be useful. It feels quite vulnerable. It's, again, not the whole answer. So if these things aren't the answer, what is? Well, we don't really know, but I think we'd all feel that part of the answer is to do what Ukraine did so effectively in the Black Sea and start using uncrewed platforms, particularly uncrewed service vessels, to inflict damage and cost on any attempted landing force or blockade force and so on. So here is a Ukrainian USV view. I think this is a Mamai um, drone, if in case you wondered, but it's approaching a Russian landing ship that's being used for logistics. Very impressive. Taiwan no doubt saw this and said, hey, that's what we should do. Now, I think most of you following this, certainly myself, this is really obvious, but it's not. Think how few navies are thinking in these terms, are doing it. Taiwan is quite brave to go out and start trying to implement what Ukraine has used so successfully. Most countries don't innovate, and you can imagine all the infighting as someone wants more landing craft or more aircraft carriers or whatever. Say, no, have these small boats. So the first one that we saw, and I'll run through all the different designs that we've seen, was the Sea Shark 400. It's approximately 4 meters long. I think that's where the name comes from, 400 millimeters, thereabouts. It's basically a jet ski, weaponized. Very small, so I don't know how big the warhead is. Mainly it's for intelligence gathering, it seems. It was rolled out about a year, less than a year actually, after the first Ukrainian USVs were publicized, were visible. So quite quick, but quite a limited design. Certainly short range, question whether it can actually damage a target. There's also an even smaller version that looks almost identical, just like a scale model, 200, so I think it's about 2 meters long. A little bit later, a major shipbuilding company, JSSC, built a sort of demonstrator or a test platform, much larger boat. You can see there's people on it. It's big enough that it can take crew. So it's optionally crewed to be technical, but it's there to test uncrewed technologies. Still a speedboat or powerboat, but quite an interesting design. Much larger, in fact, than Ukrainian designs. Much more recently, we've seen a whole raft that are of designs that are much more like the Ukrainian ones in two senses. One is they tend to be a bit smaller, and the second is they tend to be armed. The one that I'm going to focus on the most, I think, the one that attracts me the most is the Koichi, if I'm saying that right. Apologies for pronunciation. I'll carry on. It was revealed June this year by a company. It originally was called the Black Tide. It's clearly got Ukrainian influences, and in fact, possibly some of the kit that we've seen on it is with collaboration or assistance from Ukraine. I'd speculate. But in particular, it can carry missiles, a loitering munition type missile called the Jingfeng, which is basically the same as a switchblade. So a Taiwanese equivalent of a switchblade. That's the tubes you see at the back that's sort of angled up, and it can carry, 6 of those at least. It also can carry FPV drones in hangars. That's the black box on the back there, just behind the electro-optical sight. Those possibly are the same sort of containers you see on Ukrainian examples, and it can carry the drones, the FPV drones at the same time as the loitering munitions. It's only about 5 to 6 meters long, including the outboards. You'll notice how big the outboards are. Particularly look at the photos at the bottom, how heavy and chunky they are. So you'd think these are going to be massively powerful engines. It's actually not that. It's quite interesting, in fact. The design is using diesel outboards instead of petrol or gasoline. Petrol and gasoline, same thing. Just depends which version of English you speak. There's pros and cons. In general, diesel are going to be better at fuel consumption, generally seen as more reliable, but they're much bigger. They're not as good in extreme weathers, especially cold. They have an advantage for navies because they're a standard fuel. Typically, navies are trying to get every boat and ship to use the same fuels or as few types of fuel as possible. And diesel is pretty generic, ubiquitous. So if your small boats use diesel, then there'll be fuel aboard. But that's not just about supply chains, that's also about safety. Gasoline or petrol is incredibly dangerous, diesel is pretty safe. So navies and uh, merchant ships, things like that, they use diesel for a good reason. Small boats often use petrol, but this design is using diesel. Diesel engines tend to be much more expensive. The last variable is an interesting one. Diesel engines are much harder to get. There are many more small outboard motors of equivalent power that are petrol or gasoline because that's what's used on typical fishing boats. So there's pros and cons. I would say that in general, the diesel has an advantage for fuel consumption and reliability. It's also a standard fuel and it's safer, although the safety, bear in mind that there's no one on this boat, so safety might be less of an issue. But they're very large. They're not necessarily as good in extreme weather, might not be a factor for Taiwan. They cost a lot more and they're much less available. I'm find it interesting, therefore, that they've gone for diesels when everyone else building USVs has gone for petrol or gasoline outboards. Possibly it's the influence of the Navy or the naval mind, thinking is sort of over-specing things and trying to make them single fuel and safer and so on. Yeah, interesting. The same companies also build a smaller USV, Kuroshio. Yeah, I can't say that. It's tiny. It's revealed last month. It looks similar on the outside, but it's got a inboard motor with a water jet, like very similar to a jet ski. I don't have the specs on this, but you can see how much smaller it is by that white thing on the back. That is a Kometer satellite antenna, communications antenna. I don't want to go too hard on trying to measure it from that, but those things are much smaller. If you go back a couple of slides, you can see them on the back of these other boats. On the bottom photos, the bottom right two photos, you can see the same white dish and see how much smaller it looks on that than it does here. That's how much smaller this is. They're not the only people building them. We also have some competing designs. And in fact, there's something of a sort of uh, I was going to say a swim off, but something of a competition between the designs. We don't at this moment know which ones are getting built. I wouldn't necessarily trust all the reporting on that, but this is one of the other designs. It's very futuristic, sort of stealthy looking. It's fiber reinforced plastic. It's built by a company CSBC Corporation. It's quite a bit larger than the previous designs. Also very wide, of course. It does have a cockpit, so it's optionally crewed. That's quite a sensible consideration because during testing, it means you don't have to have the autonomous or remote control doing things like navigating around ports where it might crash into other boats and things like this. So for practical purposes, that's not a bad thing. It also has a big white dome on the bow. That's going to almost certainly be for a gimbal mounted, like a steerable satellite communications. Quite interesting choice, pros and cons. They tend to be quite expensive. Good kit. Again, it's got outboard motors hidden away at the back there. They're just commercial off the shelf. That's why they're white. Interesting design. Looks a bit like a spaceship. We also have the original company Thunder Tiger. They built the Sea Shark 400. They have their second generation design. It's much larger. What I've done, you've got the picture of it there, but I've overlaid the smaller Sea Shark 400 in front of it just so you can see the size difference. It's still a powerboat, but it's, I'd say, much larger than the sort of jet skis that were going before. Interestingly enough, it's got a outboard motor, but you can't tell at first because it's enclosed under a sort of cowling protection. That may have some degree of ballistic protection against machine gun fire, things like this. Bit more stealthy. And the last design that I mention is the Piranha 9. This is a very sleek looking boat built by a yacht company. It's It's very stealthy. It looks straight away stealthy, but it's also got um, radar absorbent paint. That's the black paint you can see on the right hand side. That's one of the layers. At first sight, it looks like it's got a sort of a cockpit where you'd expect to have the crew, but actually that's a drone hangar. So there's an opening at the front of that, and drones fly out. Quite quite an interesting design. So here they are together to size. Um, you can see the Sea Shark 800 is really big. So it's the Manta and the Piranha. Um, and the Kuachi, I can't say, I won't even pretend, is looking here much smaller, but it's more or less the same size as the ones that Ukraine is using. I'm sure that there are other designs that we don't know about, and we don't know which of these designs will actually enter production. Bigger question, will enough of them enter production quick enough to have any difference if China, mainland China, chooses to invade? Mentioned these are bigger. One of the reasons is geography. It's not necessarily a bad thing that they're bigger. Obviously, the larger the drone, the more likely it is to get hit by gunfire and things like this, to get seen and so on. But at the end of the day, you need a lot of fuel to go anywhere. And Taiwan is in a bit of a different situation to Ukraine when it comes to geography. So Taiwanese waters normally drawn as this sort of this the international boundaries around the main island. It's sort of a triangle there. It's incredibly close to mainland China. But there's also a lot of islands that Taiwan has control of that are some of them even closer to mainland China and some of them much further away. Compare that to Black Sea. So this is where Ukraine is operating. So Odessa is the purple dot um, on the smaller map, and then the red dots are the main ports: Sevastopol, Novorossiysk, also Kerch Bridge. So that's the Black Sea. See how much smaller it is than the waters around Taiwan. Even though Taiwan is so close to mainland, there's a lot of things that are a long way away. And if we imagine a war scenario, the Chinese targets are not just immediately across the strait. That's almost a sort of traditional way of thinking of the invasion is, oh, it just happens across the strait and that's where the war is. But China has a coastline that's thousands of kilometers long. We have lots of ports on it. And you want to be able to operate ideally all the way up those. From a Taiwanese perspective, the further they can operate, the better. Also, if China tries to blockade Taiwan, either as a prelude to war or as a way of forcing a conclusion without a shooting match, it I'm not sure exactly where the lines will be, but somewhere like that, they'll corner it off. And these USVs could be used to disrupt or counter that blockade. And China might also blockade some of the islands that are further away, either in isolation as a sort of test or as a way in, or as part of a wider blockade. It's not just about sinking ships that are trying to invade, like landing ships and ships that are enforcing blockades. We think bigger, and I maybe another video, but just to highlight that China is a maritime nation, despite what some people tell you. They're very dependent on international shipping to and from. These are very approximately the routes ships take. The one across the Pacific isn't really just a single line. Ships coming from the Pacific, come from almost every angle. These are quite vulnerable supply lines. And if China stops Taiwan's supply lines, maybe Taiwan can stop China's supply lines. Leave that thought for you. But we can see that while China is still massively outgunning Taiwan, these USVs could potentially change the equation and start shifting the calculus. Also, they're not the only thing that Taiwan is doing. Among the many other sort of Ukrainian influences, they have revealed the Black Shark XL UUV. Here's my drawing of it, photograph of it on the left. It's black one. Notice how similar, incredibly similar, almost down to certain key lines, to the M-Sub's Manta, which is a British extra large uncrewed underwater vehicle that was tested by the Royal Navy. So maybe there's a relationship there. Whether this will be armed, exactly what role, we don't know. There's mention of ASW and things like that, but what that really means and how it be used. But it gives potential, and it's not just this design. I'm sure that there are other designs both for underwater and service vessels. So let's see how it goes. Thank you for listening. Hopefully we'll never find out. The war will never happen, but it does feel very likely, doesn't it? Um, in the comments, please let me know if you appreciate the video and suggestions and things. I hope to do a few more videos. Apologies if the sound isn't any good. I don't know. I'm going to publish anyway, unscripted, unedited. I'll shut up. Thank you.